Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we are continuing to preview all 32 NFL teams for the upcoming season, and we have our last team of the AFC North today in the Pittsburgh Steelers. And like we were talking about just before the break, the quarterback battle is probably the biggest story with the Steelers this year, where last season it was far too inadequate and inconsistent play from the quarterback position. Now, I definitely am of the belief that Matt Canada was definitely holding back Kenny Pickett and that offensive group for a lot of the year. But even despite that, it was clear that an upgrade was needed to be made, and ultimately the Steelers kind of went a couple different routes all at once in order to try and fix that problem, as they signed Russell Wilson to a very cheap contract. I believe it was officially went down as a veteran minimum deal, and they went out and traded for Justin Fields, another asset that there was very little market for, and they ended up picking up two guys that have a good amount of starting quarterback experience, Wilson more so than Fields, but Fields still been the starter for the past few years and is coming off of the best season of his career. And ultimately, you feel like somewhere in there could be an answer. Now, I don't think that either one of them is the definitive answer. I know that Russell Wilson was... some of the raw stats with him in Denver don't look all that bad, but I'm just kind of trusting my eyes on this one, that Russell Wilson, clearly is a diminished version of himself. And I'm not saying that it's impossible to win with him, because Wilson was keeping the Broncos in contention for a playoff spot, but there's also more to it than that. The Broncos ended up going on this winning streak. It was from week 7 to 12, where they won 5 straight games. They won 6 of 7 games from week 7 to 14. But ultimately, and Wilson did a good enough job of just managing the game, which might be all the Steelers need at this point. But he doesn't feel like somebody who still has it in him to raise his ceiling. During that winning streak, the Broncos were very reliant on a little bit of an unheard of turnover differential, where they won the turnover battle in weeks 7 through 12 by 13 in those 5 straight wins. So, they were averaging just over 2 more turnovers than the other takeaways, I should say, than the other team during that stretch. That's not something that you can bank on as being a reliable thing. Now, again, Wilson could be just managing a game, and with this Steelers team, that might be enough, but I feel like we've seen a lot of Wilson praise this offseason. It's not that I want to take that away from him, but it's that I do have real concerns. Now, that being said, he is very likely to be the better week 1 option in comparison to Justin Fields, but we're going to have to see how this season plays out. And there is also kind of a lot of unproven at the receiver position, where you can look at Wilson last year, and no, the Broncos didn't have an elite group, but it was Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, and some promise from a rookie in Marvin Mims. That's about the level of wide receiver play I think you'll be getting with the Steelers this year, where George Pickens is their number 1 guy, who they took a couple years ago. They signed Van Jefferson in the offseason, who is a little bit more of a veteran presence. And then they're going to have to hope to some degree that Roman Wilson, their 3rd round selection out of Michigan, is able to break out for them. So it's a solid core, and I do like their tight ends as well. When you look at Freiermuth, and last year Darnell Washington ended up being a pretty nice development for them, but ultimately it is, I would say, a middling receiving core. Now, like I said, it's a question as to who is going to start week 1 for them. I believe on day 1, and we'll get more answers to this as training camp moves on here, but Russell Wilson is probably going to be the week 1 starter. But Justin Fields in a very interesting situation where if Wilson does sort of fall apart on them and Fields is able to show some sort of promise down the stretch of the year, then the final stretch of the year, then maybe he could be their long-term answer at quarterback. But it's a lot of ifs in that statement, so we will have to see there. Ultimately, when you look at their offensive numbers from last year, one of the biggest things I think going in their favor is the fact that they did get two quarterbacks that have a semi-similar play style in Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, if for nothing, at least the mobility aspect. And I feel like to some degree, Justin Fields is definitely stronger in that category, but at the same time, Russell Wilson had his most rush attempts in a season this past year since 2020. So, Wilson at this point is just looking to reestablish himself as a starting quarterback. I'm sure he would be willing to do whatever it takes to that degree. And there's already a pretty good running back combination in the backfield with Najee Harris and with Jaylen Warren. So I think that they could definitely rely on that to some degree. Now, the offensive line is very unproven, where they've addressed it in the past couple drafts with Troy Fautanu in the first round this year, Zach Frazier in the second round. Frazier, I think, was a great pickup for them. They took Broderick Jones in the first round last year, who had I would say, mostly an underwhelming season, to be perfectly candid, but at the same time, Jones could see an increased role and could just be better in year two. He didn't end up becoming the full-time starting tackle until week 8. He was fine. He had his growing pains. Hopefully, I was a fan of him coming out of college, so I would expect him to improve this upcoming year, but definitely a lot of youth and unproven entities on that offensive line, so we'll see there. But last year, that was sort of their strength, if there was one, offensively. Looking at their defense, the stats don't necessarily jump off of the page, but they were, I thought, very good. And part of that reason is because they were a little bit of the bend, don't break strategy. Also, for whatever it's worth, I don't think that their offense did them very many favors at all, where they were on the field for the majority of the games that they played in. And I think that if the offense can just be more competent, we are going to inherently see improved performance from that defense. TJ Watt is one of the best defensive players in the league. He's won a defensive player of the year. You can argue that he's been robbed of one or two more. I'm not going to get into that argument myself, but he is phenomenal. Alex Highsmith has emerged as another very impressive pass rusher to complement him on the other side. I liked the additions that they made this offseason to their linebacking core, where they went out and signed Patrick Queen to a deal in free agency, and also sneakily drafted Peyton Watson pretty late in this draft. I think it was a day 2 pick, maybe in round 3, but Peyton Wilson played football at NC State. I think when fully healthy, he has the potential to be a legitimate plus starter on this Steelers defense. Now, injuries are a very big part of the story with Peyton Wilson. We will see, but I think that he can absolutely, especially in this environment in Pittsburgh, become a real playmaker for them. In the secondary, again, kind of a situation where there is some unproven. Would do wonders for them if Joey Porter does make the leap that a lot of people are anticipating. Porter last year was sort of handicapped by the fact that he was not a very strong tackler. That was his reputation, and because of it, it cost him playing time out on the field. Now, hopefully year 2, that part of his game is at least not a total liability, that he can start to emerge as a true lockdown corner. Outside of that, I don't love their corners necessarily. They do bring back Cam Sutton, who was with the Steelers before, but ended up having a brief little stint there with the Lions last season. So that could be a that could be a solid addition for them for sure. They traded for Dante Jackson in that deal that sent out, it was Deontay Johnson during the offseason as well. Dante Jackson, not a bad cornerback. You have Minkah Fitzpatrick at the very back of that secondary playing the free safety position. So ultimately, I'm not in love with their secondary, but you can't say that they're a bottom tier group by any means. And again, with the pass rush that the Steelers defense is able to put on opposing quarterbacks, I think they are more than capable of holding their own. But looking at the Steelers the Steelers schedule for the upcoming season, you'll notice specifically on the back half of the year, you have a ton of very difficult opponents. I would say from week 11 to week 18, there is not a game you can point to and say that the Steelers are definitively going to win that game. According to Sharp Football Analysis, they have the Steelers schedule rated as the hardest one in the NFL this year. And again, you just look as it's sort of that playoff crunch time, you have a lot of division opponents, even some of your out-of-division opponents. I mean, they have to play the Eagles on the road in week 15. They're going to get the Chiefs in week 17. It is just an incredibly loaded back half of the schedule. So in order for them to have a hope to make the playoffs this year, they're going to have to take advantage during those numbers of the first few weeks. And even then, I don't know if you can necessarily point to some of those out-of-division games and guarantee them as wins. I'm looking at Atlanta on the road in week 1, against the Chargers in week 3, even at Indy in week 4. I mean, those aren't total rollover games there that they're going to have to take advantage early on in the year. That's where Russell Wilson's experience is probably going to come to play, because the Steelers aren't going to have time to maybe work Justin Fields into it, treat him as a project and hope that he can be soaring by the end of the season, because they have to take advantage of some of those weaker opponents early on. As for my prediction for their record this season, I have them going 9-8. Their over-under line is at 8.5. I was going back and forth between 8 and 9 wins, and ultimately it just came down to the fact that with this Steelers organization, with Mike Tomlin in charge, I don't believe that the Steelers are going to go sub 500. And we have seen 17 straight years of Tomlin giving them 500 ball or better, and they won 10 games last year with the disaster that was that offense. Again, the schedule is going to be extremely difficult for them, which is why I do have my concerns, but ultimately I think they squeak out that 9th win, and we'll see whether or not it is enough for a playoff spot. Looking at where we're at in terms of my personal predictions, they are going to be in the same realm as a lot of these other teams, especially their division opponents. I have all 4 of the AFC North players being 500 or better for another year. That was the case last year as well. They're going to be battling it out, absolutely. It's going to be close down the end there. You have to hope that whoever is playing quarterback is going to be able to keep up with some of those offenses that the Steelers are going to be facing down the stretch of the year. They're likely going to be able to rely on their defense a good amount. And again, they just need stability. And if that's the case, I feel like with Mike Tomlin and that defense, they're going to be able to produce a winning season. But let me know what your thoughts are on the Steelers' upcoming season in the comment section. A team that I feel like a lot of NFL fans can be a little volatile on what the expectations for them are. But we are going to be actually sticking in the city of Pittsburgh for our next segment, because across town there is a legend in the making with Paul Skeens of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who last night was able to pitch into the 9th inning for the first time of his young career in what ended up being a loss for the Pirates, but he just continues to be a phenomenon. So we are going to be diving into all of that, but First, we have to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.